It is my privilege as president of the Unitarian Universalist Association to welcome you all to the 2003 Frederic G. Melcher Book Award ceremony. I'd like to thank the Reverend Thomas Michelson and First Parish in Cambridge for hosting tonight's event in this historic meeting house. Also, on behalf of the Unitarian Universalist Association, my sincere thanks go to Cambridge Forum, co-sponsors of tonight's event. The late Frederic G. Melcher, a successful publisher and dedicated Unitarian lay leader, conceived the idea for an annual award to honor a work judged to have made, and I quote, the most significant contribution to religious liberalism, close quote. After Frederic Melcher's death in 1964, his son Daniel Melcher funded the Melcher Book Award endowment in his father's memory. The Melcher Award has marked the achievements of such influential writers as Dorothy Day, Eric Erickson, Joseph Campbell, Toni Morrison, and last year, James Carroll. And tonight, we are very pleased to add to this list the name of Richard Rodriguez for his book, Brown, The Last Discovery of America. The world we inhabit tonight is one of uncertainty and fear. The United States has emerged from military actions in Afghanistan and Iraq, and, some say, is looking over the landscape for the place of its next demonstration of power. AIDS is ravaging an entire continent. The threat of terrorism is felt from New York to Tel Aviv and from Riyadh to Bali. And domestic budget cuts mean that the poor and the sick and the elderly will find it ever more difficult to make it through the day. At this time in our history, I believe that the ideals recognized by the Melcher Award are more relevant than ever. The Unitarian Universalist Association is proud to honor the work of writers who have dedicated themselves to serving justice by illuminating the human condition. We have no pretense that this is a simple task. Early in Brown, Rodriguez writes, "Books should confuse. Literature abhors the typical. Literature cannot betray the grandeur of its subject. There is only one subject, what it feels like to be alive. Nothing is irrelevant. Nothing is typical." Lately, as I have traveled the country visiting our Unitarian Universalist congregations, I have been preaching about hope and how hard hope is to find in these trying times, but how important it is to find a ground on which we can stand. And I tell you, the truth and beauty of Richard Rodriguez's writing have given me hope. Rodriguez says, "I think Brown marks a reunion of peoples, an end to ancient wanderings. Rival cultures and creeds conspire with spring to create children of a beauty, perhaps of a harmony, previously unknown. It is this conspiracy of cultures, creeds, and spring that Richard Rodriguez celebrates and which gives me hope." And now I'd like to introduce the chair of the Melcher Book Award Committee, the Reverend Patrick O'Neill, to present the citation. Patrick?
Thank you. I would like to thank the other members of the Melcher Book Award Committee, Thomas Michelson, Carol Fontaine, Kay Montgomery, and Ted Thomas. We have what is undoubtedly the best job in the UUA. We get together several times a year, nominate and read great books, and get to choose one to honor at this award ceremony every year. And then we have the pleasure of meeting the great people who do this distinguished writing. I was saying to Richard that he is not the most radical, dissident Catholic to receive this award, since Dorothy Day and Daniel Berrigan and James Carroll all precede him. Richard Rodriguez is the 36th laureate to be so honored with the Melcher Award. You have heard some of the distinguished names that have received this award in the past. Richard expressed to me this evening some question of whether his writing really qualified as being liberal religious writing. And the answer to that is only if you consider writing in behalf of social justice, only if you consider giving voice to the voiceless, only if you consider speaking for the empowerment of those who have no power, only if you consider giving voice to people whose very darkness allows them to be invisible in this society. Richard's writing is more poetry than prose at certain points in a day that is increasingly obsessed with mass media, when voices are too often framed in the lowest common denominator of language. This poet rises to give a different voice. In a society that increasingly fails to celebrate the very individualism that gave it its greatest promise, Richard Rodriguez rises to offer an intensely resonant first-person declaration, speaking as a brown man, as a man of proud Mexican heritage, as a homosexual man, as a dissident Catholic voice in a conservative time. Richard Rodriguez rises to speak as an I. I'd like to read the words of the citation of the Melcher Award for you. Richard, would you join me up here? Brown, The Last Discovery of America. Richard Rodriguez is among us, entre nosotros. We say yes to this phenomenology of Brown, this pen of reconciliation, this color of our future. We hear the prophet of mixed souls in the Americas, this warbler of deliverance. We prize this itinerary of the Brown millennium that guides us through the Sistine Chapel, James Baldwin's preoccupation, and Malcolm X's fierceness, Carl T's sadness, and Bruegel's peasants, a year with Lawrence of Arabia, and a song with Mabel Mercer, the dances of Prince Lightfoot, the metaphors of Richard Nixon, the mystery of the avocado, and the cubism of our crucifix. Richard Rodriguez is a theatrical intruder into the tragedy of race consciousness in our America, with its Latino lovers, Hispanic fictions, and the Puritan eye. We express gratitude at his skill to reveal the brownness of our libraries, the greenness of our knowledge, and we marvel at a courage to write the unpursued scenes of our democracy, even as he takes us through the graveyard of black and white discourses to the Brown paradox of us. Why these affirmations for yet another discovery of America? Because Brown calls us to see through the veils of our erotic history, as well as this writer's language, and learn to love the persons who are becoming and yet to come just behind the words. So stick around with Brown. Richard, congratulations. You honor us. Thank you.
This is quite extraordinary. I may not be a dissident Catholic, but my Irish Catholic nuns would have something to say about this evening. It was they, and they were wonderful women, who nonetheless warned me against the danger, this was in the 1950s, the danger of mixed marriages, by which they didn't mean the danger of marrying out of your race, but the danger of marrying a Methodist. So what they would make of this award, of this honor, of this remarkable evening in this beautiful place. I'm so proud to be here. I've walked by this church many times, wandered through the cemetery, wondered about the Dana plot outside, and wondered whether that was indeed my Dana, the great Dana who came up the Pacific coast of the Americas in the 19th century, and then returned, I thought, rather sadly, to Cambridge, having left behind his heroic past in California. So it's wonderful to be here. To speak of a book that I had no expectation for, truly. Brown is a difficult, complicated brown book. And I am a writer, and I know the world, and I know that there are fewer and fewer of you out there who can read, or who have patience to read, or who want to read brown books. We want, on Oprah, we want something quicker and simpler, and we want to know whether you're for it or against it, and come on and come off, and don't brown the conversation, because it gets too complicated after a while, and we cannot deal with brownness as an idea. I owe the birth of this book to two people. One is my agent, Georges Borchardt, in New York, and the other is my mother. I will explain both. Georges was sitting with me in a French restaurant on East 57th Street, which is now closed, having been for many years a plot of the mafia to money launder. And we were sitting enjoying French food, and Georges was suggesting to me that maybe I needed to write a book about Hispanics, since no one in New York, certainly no one at the editorial offices of the New York Times, seemed to know what a Hispanic was. And it might be a good idea to try to describe who Hispanics are in America. At that moment, I was playing with my dessert, and I was looking at this waiter who was coming toward our table with coffee, and I was trying to decide whether he was Puerto Rican or Moroccan, and I could not tell. In any case, I began to write the book that my agent suggested. The trouble was that it began to bore me pretty quickly. To try to write a book about Hispanics is to face almost immediately the paradox that there are no Hispanics in Latin America. You can travel through Peru or Bolivia or Ecuador or Mexico or Puerto Rico. You can ask Jennifer Lopez or Octavio Paz whether they have ever seen a Hispanic. And they will tell you that there are Hispanics in the United States. In fact, there is a Hispanic tonight in Cambridge, Massachusetts. If you rush, you can actually go hear him tonight. Richard Nixon invented Hispanics in 1972. I write about Nixon in a chapter which I like very much in this book called Poor Richard, which is a chapter about not only Richard Nixon and my tie to Richard Nixon, both of us scholarship boys, but my tie also to Benjamin Franklin and to professional wrestling. As I say, this is a very brown book. 1972 was also the year that Pierre Elliott Trudeau invented multiculturalism in Canada. And all of these years, you good citizens of Cambridge and Boston, all of these years you have been drinking Canadian water with the assurance that, unlike Mexican water, it was pure. But there was a little virus in it, and it was called multiculturalism, and you have swallowed it. And you have all become Canadians. I am here to persuade you tonight of the possibility of Mexico, the Mexican alternative, for surely now the most interesting borders in the United States are not the borders that distinguish the two oceans, east from west, but the borders that separate us hot from cold. Canada from Mexico, tundra from desert. On the one hand, there is Canada with its proposal that the way to deal with this complex auditorium tonight is by celebrating your diversity. And then there is Mexico, which speaks erotically of melting down, bodies piled on bodies, sweating bodies, groaning bodies, children being created who look like none of their grandparents. I quickly got bored doing this book on Hispanics, and what was interesting to me was only the fact that Hispanics in the popular imagination, even though we do not belong to a race, Hispanics generally are put somewhere between black and white on the pages of the Boston Globe, and that we are identified somehow in the popular imagination as being a brown people, when in fact we come in all colors. Why brown, I thought to myself. So many mornings you sit at a table in front of a blank sheet of paper, and these are your preoccupations. Why brown? You are many months, years away from an evening in Cambridge, Massachusetts, that you would ever be in this room, the room that Emerson spoke in, strikes you as improbable indeed. So why brown indeed? 10 o'clock in the morning, there would be the doorbell, and it was my UPS man. My UPS man is a Samoan, African, Filipino, something like that. But what really makes him brown indeed is that he has blue hair. It became more and more interesting to me, this question of brown, the color brown. What is it? You start asking painters, you start asking artists about brown, and what they will tell you is that brown is not a primary color like red or like yellow. Brown is not even a secondary color like purple, created by two. To get a deep, rich, messy shade of brown, you need to blend, mix several colors together. It is the color you get when you clean the paintbrush at the bottom of the canvas. It is messy. It reminds us of human waste, which reminds us that in fact we are destined, as the Bible tells us, to turn into mud. It reminds us of time, all things brown in time. It reminds me of the day in Sacramento, California, that summer day that I left the box of Crayolas in the summer sun. Careless child, inattentive child. I left the box of Crayolas in the summer sun. August in Sacramento, blistering white heat. Cloudless days. My mother came out to the garden to hang some wash on the line, and she stepped on the box of Crayolas. Splat. She thought it was something the dog had left behind. It was human civilization under her foot. That is brown. These first paragraphs, I don't read very well, but I want to read tonight, just because this is at the very end of a tour that has gone on for a year talking about brown. And I very rarely read from this book, this brown book. These are the first paragraphs from the preface. Brown as impurity. I write of a color that is not a singular color, not a strict recipe, not an expected result, but a color produced by careless desire, even by accident, by two or several. I write of blood that is blended. I write of brown as complete freedom of substance and narrative. I extol impurity. I eulogize a literature that is suffused with brown, with illusion, irony, paradox, pleasure. I write about race in America in hopes of undermining the notion of race in America. Brown bleeds through the straight line, unstaunchable. The line separating black from white, for example. Brown confuses. Brown forms at the border of contradiction, the ability of language to express two or several things at once, the ability of bodies to experience two or several things at once. It is that brown faculty I uphold by attempting to write brownly. And I defy anyone who tries to unblend me or to say what is appropriate to my voice. You will often find brown in this book as a cement between leaves of paradox. You may not want paradox in the book, in which case you had better seek a pure author. Brown is the color most people in the United States associate with Latin America. Apart from stool sample, there is no browner smear in the American imagination than the Rio Grande. No adjective has attached itself more often to the Mexican in America than dirty, which I assume gropes toward the simile dirt-like, indicating dense concentrations of melanin. I am dirty, all right. In Latin America, what makes me brown is that I am made of the conquistador and the Indian. My brown is a reminder of conflict and of reconciliation. In my own mind, what makes me brown in the United States is that I am Richard Rodriguez. My baptismal name and my surname marry England and Spain, Renaissance rivals. North of the U.S.-Mexico border, brown appears as the color of the future. The adjective accelerates, becomes a verb. America is browning. South of the border, brown sinks back into time. Brown is time. So what makes me brown in America is that complicated moment of 16th century birth, long before Nixon, 400 years before Nixon, the meeting of the Indian and the conquistador. Mexico has chosen to describe the meeting as his violent erotic desire for her, his rape of her. I've always thought the possibility was equal, that she wanted him, that she had waited for him. And he, determined to believe that he had discovered the new world, that he was the actor in history, described himself as the actor at that moment, never suspecting that she wanted him. Let's leave it at that. I was born in the 16th century from that violent collision, from that tender embrace of the Indian and the conquistador. I cannot tell you now who is speaking to you, whether this is the Indian speaking to you or the Spaniard. I do not know when my grandfather ends and my grandmother begins. I am both. I raped myself. When you are brown as I am, the notion of seeking from history some remedy, some compensation, is an absurdity. I am both villain and victim. I am brown. I do not come to praise Latin America tonight. My parents had to flee Mexico. There are too many people tonight, even tonight, on this warm spring night, who are standing on the border between Mexico and the United States, running tonight in the dark, trying to get to Dallas or Omaha. I do not come to praise Mexico. Mexico has betrayed her poor. Mexico betrayed my parents. I hate Mexico. But in one respect, Mexico is superior to the United States and has been for several hundred years. Mexico speaks of the body. Mexico speaks of erotic desire. Mexico speaks of people falling in love, of bedrooms, of children being born. In Latin America, in Brazil, there are over 300 ways of saying brown in Brazilian Portuguese. If papi is this, and mommy is this, and baby is this. In Mexico, in 17th century Mexico, there was an artistic tradition of las castas, where you would have a father and a mother pictured of different hues, different races, African, Indian, European, and mixtures within those races, and their child in front of them, their child who looked exactly not like any of them. Behind them would be parrots and pineapples, indications that we were within the landscape, within the experience of the new world, that we were really living something that was new, that adjective new world had force to it. My friend Michael, who's a fireman in San Francisco, tells me what every African-American friend of mine has told me somewhere in the course of our friendship. By the way, he tells me that he is part American Indian. Every African-American friend of mine has told me that. The story of the love affair between the African and the Indian in the Americas is one of the most extraordinary love stories, and it is almost nowhere told in our history books. We do not talk of love in our history books. Only grandmothers in America know the true history of America. We give Pulitzer Prizes to dreadful little historians at Yale and Virginia who write biographies of Thomas Jefferson and wear little bow ties. We give them Pulitzer Prizes, and they always forget to tell us who those brown children were playing behind Monticello, whose children they were. I want my money back. It is a wonderful thing to come to America, to be an immigrant child in America, to be handed America as a set of ideas, which is what Americans tell you America is, a set of ideas. Believe in these, clutch these, claim these ideas, and you are an American. There is no blood here, America says. No common ancestry. What binds us together is a set of ideas. It is wonderful. But there is also what I call the five senses of America. There is a smell to America. There is a taste to America. A young Cuban American told me he was with the Mariolita boat exodus from Cuba, from Fidel Castro's terrible Cuba, when the filmmakers were making their films from New York and flying to Cuba to embrace El Doctor. These Cubans were rushing off to come to Miami. But he says when he came to Florida for the first days, America had a smell like a deodorizer, he says. It's like Pine Sol. For maybe 2 weeks it lasted, and then it drifted away. I was a judge a few years ago, 2 years ago actually, it seems longer. I was a judge for a literary contest for the National Book Awards last year. It is a dreadful task to read 900 books in 1 month. You wonder why we give it to the predictable contestant. You wonder why Robert Caro wins everything in America. To be faced with a 900-page Robert Caro book, we try the first 9 pages and we say, "You've won it." I was a judge last year for the National Book Awards. And I thought to myself, reading these books, how little there is said in America, how little there is said about the taste of America. And then suddenly there is this book by a Chinese emigre. I don't know who he is. I can't remember the title of the book. I think Knopf published it. He'd come from terrible China, come to America, ended up maybe in Cambridge, ended up maybe at the dreadful Kennedy School where people go to die. But he said when he came here for the first few weeks of America, everything in America smelled like cut grass. And then that smell faded away. We know about you, we say about you behind your back when you are not listening to us, when you are talking about your diet or your exercise regimen. We say about you when you're not listening to us that you are beginning to look like your dog. It's not very remarkable to begin to look like your dog. It happens every day in America. You walk your dog every night, you start looking like your dog. More remarkably, your dog starts looking like you. There is an American type, and you see him in the Cairo Hilton, and you can hear him in the Cairo Hilton all the way across the room, over by the potted palm. He is wearing Bermuda shorts and a straw hat, and he is asking the busboy, calling the busboy by his first name, of course, and slapping him on the back, what this big coin is worth. And the more remarkable thing is that he sees you. He recognizes you and hides somewhere behind the pillar because he's coming towards you, the American. We look like one another. We talk like one another. We slouch like one another. We do not talk of such things. We do not talk of bodies in America. We do not have bodies in America. We do not fall in love in America. We do not look at each other in a room as holy as this. We do not flirt. We do not wonder about the body sitting in front of us or next to us, or indeed whether I am going to end up looking like the person I am sitting next to tonight, or whether I already do. Take a look at the person sitting next to you sometime this evening, and you'll see why. I remember at Sacred Heart School in Sacramento, California, at Thanksgiving time, the nuns used to give us these mimeograph drawings to color, the Pilgrims and the Indians. It wasn't a very interesting affair to color these pilgrims. They were all dressed in black, Giorgio Armani black. And they all had straight lines for mouths, and they all lived in Cambridge. The Indians were more interesting. The Indians came to Thanksgiving dinner dressed for Halloween. The Indians came to the Puritan feast almost in parody of the Puritans' fear of the playhouse, with feathers and painted faces. There was Olivia de Havilland coming to Thanksgiving dinner. I loved painting the Indians. They sit, they have poached salmon. The last we see of the Indians are going back into the forest looking for Pepto-Bismol. But that's the end of the story. No one falls in love. No one exchanges email. No one exchanges star signs. No one asks for nicknames. No one looks at anyone else. It is all very chaste. So you wonder why my friend Michael does not know what to call himself. He who is a fireman in San Francisco, who tells me that he is part Indian. I say to my friend Michael, well, then you're not black. And he said, what do you mean I'm not black? He said, as long as that's what a white cop sees when he looks at me, I am black. And I say, Michael, in Mexico, we have a name for you. In 18th century Mexico, the Indian tired of doing the Europeans' work. Do it yourself, she said. You want the gold? Here's the shovel. He was in his ruffles and his silks and his satins. He could not do it. He could not do the work. He wanted the gold, but he did not want the shovel. Mexico imported Africa to do the work that the Indian would not do. It was the agreement of the civic government and the church that the children of African Indian birth would be born free, which perhaps explained why he married her. But what did she see in him? His beauty, his defiance, his resilience, everything melts in Mexico. Within a generation, the African population begins to melt into the Indian population. The interesting thing about that is that the children of African Indian birth were called Chinos. The African impregnated the Indian and released from her Asian secret. She was born on the other side of the Pacific. And the children were born looking Mongolian. I have come here tonight to Cambridge, Massachusetts, to tell you that the world is round as Columbus surmised. And sooner or later, you or your grandchildren or your great-grandchildren are all going to end up looking like Keanu Reeves. Anglo-Canadian mother, Hawaiian Chinese father. My nieces and nephews all look like Keanu Reeves, even the girls. A boy named Buddy came up to me on the schoolyard. I don't remember what passed as prologue, but I do not forget what Buddy divulged to me. If you're white, you're all right. If you're brown, stick around. If you're black, stand back. It was as though Buddy had taken me up to a mountaintop and shown me the way things lay in the city below. In Sacramento, my brown was not halfway between black and white. On the leafy streets on the east side of town where my family lived, where Asians did not live, where Negroes did not live, my family's Mexican shades passed as various. We did not pass for white. My family passed among white, as in one of those old cartoons where Clarabelle Cow goes shopping downtown, and the mercantile class of dogs does not remark her exception, as opposed to Amos and Andy, whose downtown was a parallel universe of no possible admixture. And as easily as I pass in these pages between being an American and regarding America from a distance, as opposed also to the famous photograph of a little girl in Little Rock in the pages of Life magazine. A black girl no older than Alice must pass through the looking glass. I remember wondering what my brown would have meant to Little Rock, how my brown would have withstood Little Rock. In the Sacramento of the 1950s, it was as though white simply hadn't time enough to figure brown out. It was a busy white time. Brown was like the skinny or fat kids left over after the team captains showed sides. You take the rest. My cue to wander away to the sidelines, to wander away. My parents had come from Mexico, a short road in my imagination. I felt myself as coming from a caramelized planet, an upside-down planet, pineapple cratered. Though I was born here, I came from the other side of the looking glass, as did Alice, though not alone like Alice. Downtown, I saw lots of brown people, old men on benches, winks from Filipinos. Sikhs who worked in the fields were the most mysterious brown men, their heads wrapped in turbans. They were the rose men. They looked like roses. And the Palestinian communist bookie, entirely hearsay, who ran a tobacco store of pungent brownness, the smell of rum-soaked cigars and cheap, cherry-scented pipe tobacco, was himself as brown as a rolled cigar, but the more mysterious for having been born in Bethlehem. And as we passed very close to the young man, close enough for me to smell him, something anointing his hair. He was the most beautiful man, my first consciousness of the necessity for oxymoron. The most beautiful man I remember seeing as a boy. He wore a suit vest over his naked torso. He wore a woman's gold locket with a dark red stone. He was petting a dog in the street. His pants knees were dirty. He smelled of coconut. He smiled brilliantly as we passed. The missing tooth. "Gypsy," my mother said, taking me firmly by the hand, refusing his blazing notice with an averted nod. I had seen the gypsy's mother, she must be his mother, dozens of times, sitting on a lawn chair outside her office on H Street, near my father's work. There was a sign in the window beneath which we sat, a blank hand outlined in neon. She never sought or met my gaze. She looked Mexican to me. Not Mexican, my parents assured me. My brother said, "Watch out, Ricky. She's reading your tombstone." A boy with a face as dark as mine, but several years older, stepped out of the crowd at the State Fair to press a warm dime into my hand, said nothing, wanted nothing apparently, disappeared. His curious solemnity. But I interpreted, because I remember the transaction, as one of brown eyes. My uncle from India was several times called nigger by strangers downtown in Sacramento. His daughter Delia forbade the rhyme as I learned at school, eeny, meeny, miny, mo. But her eyes softened as she corrected me, and her mouth softened. Brown is a bit of a cave in my memory, like Delia's eyes. Lights Up then, on theme from A Summer Place, on blue and gold and electric guitar strings. A decade on, I'm staying for a month of summer in Laguna Beach with the family of my best friend Larry Flaherty. I'm covered with a cool film of sea and ski, as is Larry, though I suspect the insistence on this precaution by Larry's mother is gratuitous in my case. Larry's mother is sitting on the deck with a neighbor, a red-faced woman with protuberant, pale blue eyes, penciled eyebrows. The bug-eyed woman burbles into her tomato juice cocktails. "Some niggers." I can feel the hairs lift on the back of my neck. "Some niggers came onto the beach over the weekend." She glances at me while she is saying this. Her eyes are needles. I am the camel. We let them know they weren't welcome. It's not clear where I fit into her use of the first-person plural. Finally, however, my presence does not disturb her narrative. Years later, the same story, a different summer, Columbia, South Carolina, a different storyteller. a lawyer in New York, rehearses his famous anecdote, The Hawaiian Stranger, in 3 passages, 2 tumblers of scotch. 1, it is summer 1944. World War II is coming to an end. There is no tragic close to this story. The boys in it will not taste the tin can of death. The lawyer's mother, gallantly streaming, has decided to invite a bevy of boys so far from home from a nearby base onto her lawn for a 4th of July picnic. Of course, a complement of young ladies has been invited as well. Sally's and Dorothy's, women from town and from the college. 2, the day dawns golden syrup. Mosquitoes. The hired help arrive first, disinterested, capable hands. By and by, the young men arrive. Smiles, sweat rings, aftershave. The young women arrive also in summer dresses. There will be games to put the gentlemen at ease. The women arrange themselves in wicker chairs, sip cool drinks, and appraise the gentlemen from the shade of the porch. Volleyball. But summer in South Carolina, the lawyer sighs, 5 decades later, rattling the ice in his glass. 3, Scotch number 2. Conspicuous among the young recruits is a tall brown man with short cropped hair, the Hawaiian. Poor mama. Another Coca-Cola, Mr. Cook? She could just about manage that one. But during the volleyball game, Mr. Cook sheds first his shirt, then his T-shirt. The narrator remembers the sight of brown shoulders, brown nipples, a navel-attempted vertigo. Why do we remember such things and not who invented the cotton gin? And the sweat streaming down Mr. Cook's rib cage, his flared nostrils. Poor mama. Poor narrator. Nevertheless, mama keeps her stride, marching her fruit-bobbing sandals into the house and back out to the yard. More potato salad, key lime pie, lemonade. Each time she'd pass me, I was sitting alone under the shade tree. She'd detour, she'd come around the trunk of the tree, bend down so low, so close I could smell her powder. She pretended to be fixing my collar or working my cowlick, but her whisper came furious, down as a fly swatter. He ain't either a nigger. You mind yourself. He's Hawaiian. Stories darken with time, some of them. It is one of the little ironies, one of the self-pitying ironies, now moderated by this award, this Melcher Book Award. One of the little ironies of my life is that I've ended up in the brown section of Borders Books. You should not trust a bookstore that calls itself Borders, by the way. I ended up in a section which is south of the border, south of astrology, and just over to the left of lesbian literature, called Latin American Studies. It is very lonely over there. I speak very bad Spanish, and most of the Latin Americans near me are very haughty about it. We do not speak after the store is closed. Whereas on the other side of the bookstore are so many of the books that I love. Way over there, is a section called Black Literature. And there sits James Baldwin with his frog eyes. James Baldwin, who taught me to write calmly when you are angry. And over there in the section marked Literature, which means whiteness, I think, there is D.H. Lawrence, the great Lawrence, the son of the coal miner, who taught me to trust the sensual in my writing. When the store closes, when Borders closes, we have a fine old time over by the espresso machine. We all get together. It's a very brown world in there at night. But when the store opens in the morning and the tiresome girl with the ring through her nose comes and starts the espresso machine, we all go to our separate corners. I hate it. I will ask you tonight to do what I've asked other audiences to do. If you see me in the Latin American section, would you please pick me up? Would you take me somewhere? I don't care where it is. Take me to Grand Opera. Get me out of there. I want to be an illegal immigrant at Borders Books. I was talking to some bureaucrats at the Census Bureau in Washington a few weeks ago, and they told me that by the year 2010, which is now 7 years away, we may be, for the last time, faced with a census form which asks us for our race. Because so complicated has America become, so brownly now are we speaking in public, that it is now becoming impossible to respond to all the possible ways that we can say race in America. The two most prominent African Americans now speak brownly of themselves. I mean Tiger Woods, who says he is not black because it would disown his mother from Thailand. Tiger Woods is Thai and African and white. And Colin Powell says on page 8 of his autobiography, or 8 or 9, that he's African, yes, but he's also Caribbean Indian and Scots-Irish and Anglo-Saxon. Imagine the history of America that grandmothers would write if they could write that history. We have left it to historians at Harvard to write the history of America. And they have written the history of America as the history of battles and conflicts and civil wars and disagreements and my triumph and your loss. But they never write the story of love. And we, because we lack the grammar even to respond to what Colin Powell has just told us, even though we have heard what Colin Powell has just said, still refer to him as our first black Secretary of State. We haven't a mouth big enough to say brown yet. It is too difficult. Even though everything in Cambridge, Massachusetts tonight is sexually possible, it is still too hard to say, I am brown. I am brown. Because I am in this holy place, I must speak to you of one of the consequences of our lovemaking that has been too little remarked upon, but perhaps noticed by the Unitarian Church long before the rest of us noticed. There is a man who comes up to me in Baltimore, Maryland, who says that he is Jewish and his wife is a Hindu, and the kids call themselves Hinjus. There is a girl in Atlanta, Georgia, who comes up to me and says, my mother is Korean, my father is African. I'm a Korean African. And then she says, when I seem unimpressed by that little revelation, she says, I'm also a Baptist Buddhist. To speak brownly is to refuse to deny the parent of either side, is to claim both parents, is to want both parents. I told a group of theologians, Lutheran theologians up in Seattle, Washington, that I had met a Baptist Buddhist in Georgia. And the Lutheran minister said that that was impossible. It is a contradiction in terms to be a Baptist Buddhist. But I told them that she walks. A young woman writes to me from suburban Maryland. She tells me that she is the daughter of her father, an Iranian Muslim, her mother, a New York Jew, she says. She's a Jewish Muslim. I do not know whether our seminaries even can speak brownly yet. Forget the politicians. Forget the historians at Harvard. I don't know whether anyone from the pulpit is able to speak about the brown religion that we are facing ahead of us. Except I will tell you that there are people in the world tonight who conspire against brown, the religious color of brown, who want to clarify the line, who want to make straight the Baroque curve. There are people, fundamentalists, among the three desert religions in America who want to establish a fundamental purity again. because the world has gone too brown. And you know them, and I know them, and they want purity precisely because we are their neighbors. My father died about a year ago. He was followed in death a year later by my mother. I was in their house, their empty house, just after Christmas, emptying 9 decades of life in boxes, folding dresses, and hats. It's a difficult chore to box the clothing and the papers and the photographs of one's parents. And at one point I went out to the backyard, this now weedy backyard on 29th Avenue in San Francisco, a more prosaic street you cannot imagine. But it occurred to me standing outside in that winter cool of a late winter afternoon that the people who lived next door to my Mexican Catholic parents are Chinese Confucians on the one side. On the other side, there are American Baptists. On the other side of them, there are Greek Orthodox. On the other side of them, there are Russian Jews. On the other side of them, I don't know who they are. I think they're from Cambridge, Massachusetts. They believe in clean water. On the other side of them are Methodists, and down the block it goes. I had been to families in America, particularly Filipino families for some reason. I don't know what it is about water, but places with water have had a long knowledge of brown. Sicily, the Philippines, the brownest state in the Union today is Hawaii. The highest miscegenation rate is Hawaii. Something is moving west to east in America, the color brown. And there at the Filipino Thanksgiving, nothing at all like the Indians and the Pilgrims. There is a Muslim brother-in-law sitting next to a Mormon cousin, sitting next to a Baptist, sitting next to an Apostolic Assembly, sitting next to a Roman Catholic. Family. Never has it been more essential in the world, in this dangerous world, especially at a time when the 3 desert religions are at each other's throats. Islam, Christianity, Judaism, these 3 religions which have borrowed so much from each other, which have lived side by side with each other, which have been influenced by one another. Never has it been so urgent for us to speak brownly as people of religious faith. And then my Mexican aunt married my uncle from India. It was the 1950s. Americans would call the 50s a very dull time. It was not dull for me. My uncle from India had an enchanted name. His name was Krishna. And we were Americanized enough, even in those years, to be driven crazy by a name with 2 syllables, so we had to shorten it. We called him Krish. Every Christmas, I remember the Hindus coming for Christmas dinner. I remember turbans and Christmas. It seemed as natural to me as summer days in Sacramento. Ramesh would come. We always worried that he would stand on his head after dinner rather than before. Everyone encouraged Ramesh to stand on his head if he was going to do it this year. Before dinner, please, Ramesh. Dr. Gupta, who was my uncle's sister, who owned lots of real estate in San Francisco, my mother whispered. Dr. Gupta would stretch her brown hands and would chant a Hindu prayer over the turkey. And then something began to bug me. It was about the year in which I began to realize that there was something wrong with me. I was a queer little boy, after all. And I knew, or I sensed, that there was nothing more dangerous in the world than to admit to the world, to my parents, to my teachers, to you, to this microphone, to admit to you that I was in love with the wrong sex. So I was already aware, always watching as a child, for eroticism that was dangerous. I remember seeing a black man and a blonde woman walk down the street in Sacramento. I can see them in front of me now. They were coming toward us. I must have been about 8 years old. I want to go over to them and put my arms around them and tell them, take care, be careful. It is dangerous to love in America. This blonde lady starts showing up at our Christmas dinners, our Hindu Christmas dinners. I can deal with the turbans, I can deal with the sombreros, I cannot deal with the blonde lady. Who in the hell is the blonde lady? She starts showing up, she has this hair that's so blonde it's white. It's sort of ash blonde, they call it in Clairol ads. She wears a blue dress, she sits over there on the sofa in my aunt's house, demurely putting the coffee cup on her lap. She smiles a lot, she does not laugh. Who is the blonde lady? Why does she come every year? I'm bothering my mother, pestering my mother with my questions, my queer little questions, my brown little questions. Why has the brown lady come? I am breathing against the car window in the back seat. It is a cold night. I am breathing against the glass and making a cloud form. I am playing with the cloud that I have formed with my breath, running with my finger, drawing circle within circle within circle. Who is the blonde lady? My mother is tired. It has been a long Christmas season. What is it that you want to know? She asks of her precocious son. I want to know why she comes every year. Who is she? I can deal with India. I can deal with Mexico. My mother sighs. Her voice sounds in the dark. She is married to your Uncle Krish's nephew. They were law students together at Berkeley. They fell in love. That phrase, they fell in love, just hangs in the air. That's what I wanted to know. Where love takes us. Where we do not expect to go. The children we did not expect to have. The woman who comes up to me now in Des Moines, or was it Omaha? Or was it Boston? Or was it Nashville? She looks vaguely like Lucille Ball, piles and piles of red hair. She says, I want you to meet my granddaughter. Korean face. Where love takes us. I want to credit tonight Georges Borchardt for having encouraged from me a book about Hispanics, which led to this book about Brown. I want to thank my mother for answering my question with that phrase, which has hung in my imagination all these years. They fell in love, with a reminder so deep, so piercing, so true, so historically more accurate than anything I've ever heard from most history departments in this country, that she taught me at that moment to look at America with brown eyes. Thank you very much. There is time for questions. The last time I was at the Kennedy School, I was warned by Harvey Mansfield that there is a loony in Cambridge who goes to every lecture. And Harvey said, do not answer the question of the loony. And of course, I said, as I am about to say now, are there any questions? And this hand went up immediately. I don't know whether it was Tip O'Neill or Jack Kennedy, or I don't know who it was. But I said, yes, grateful for a question.
I'm going to ask William Sinkford to ask the first question.
I'm
that
the
ought
loony.
to take you.
Oh, sorry. I have my built-in loony here.
That would be me. Richard, I'm a person of color, African American, and I have two children who are, as they describe themselves, or at least as they used to describe themselves, biracial, meaning white and African American or black, and both of them experience their world, I think, much differently than I experienced mine growing up. And they're very patient with me. I mean, they listen to my stories and the language that I use to describe myself and how it is to possibly live a good life. But I am very aware that they will be telling different stories and using different language and different images and metaphors. What images do you think they might find most comforting?
Well, I think to ask the question of me is the wrong tack. I think in some ways we are about to be led by our children, because I think what you say is true. I notice that the children in America seem to be living in a reality that is ahead of their parents now. They are simply living differently, certainly in places like California, and they are naming themselves. I mean, I think of the kids who call themselves in Los Angeles Blaxicans, for example. They are naming themselves precisely because we adults do not have names to give them. There are no adult names for the children who are being born. And they are naming themselves with a kind of freedom, with a kind of whimsy, with a kind of irreverence, with a kind of playfulness that suggests that they are aware that they are leading the way. And it seems to me that they must offer us the consolation. They must teach us some way of dealing with this ambiguity of identity. It is clear to me, as someone who is related to Mexico, I should tell you, lest you be under any impression that I'm romanticizing Mexico, that if you go to Mexico and turn on Mexican television, it's like watching Swedish television. Televisa is like Norwegian television. It's in the capital of peroxide. Everyone is blonde in Mexico. And you should wonder why a country that speaks and acknowledges brown so easily and vividly is also so afraid of its face. Sometimes children who are brown become very afraid of their own brownness and cannot live with the mythology of their brownness. I am thinking of children who are now in this world. We are now 4 years away from Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado. We adults, I use the term loosely, we adults still haven't yet to connect the dots. It was the grandson, listen to me carefully, it was the grandson of an observant Jew who chose Hitler's birthday to go into the school cafeteria to shoot it up. Connect the dots. There are children who are being born so brownly that they will go to war against their brownness and will make us pay the price. On the other hand, there are children being born in this world, and precisely, I think, the freedom of the non-European populations now in the United States, as they marry into both European and African. In the old dialectic, the black and white dialectic, was so difficult, is that African Americans, by the one-drop theory, were denied the color brown, unless you lied altogether and passed as white, passed out of blackness. But you were denied black. You were denied brown by the one-drop theory. If you had one drop of African blood, you were black, no matter how light your skin, how straight your hair. But in the Samoan African dialectic, there is no difficulty of being both. Or in the Korean European dialectic, there is no difficulty of being both. And there is now a freedom, I think, that these new populations, the global populations of America, have given us verbally the freedom to speak in this multiple ways, in the way that the old dialectic between Europe and Africa that so consumed the public conversation in this country for so many centuries, that now gives way to the more interesting freedom to speak brownly.
I'd also like to ask Patrick O'Neill if he has a question to address to you.
You were mentioning to me earlier this evening, Richard, the experience you're having in presenting your book and talking about your book and having people come up to you afterwards and say, I saw a part of myself in your experience. And Would you say something about that? Because sometimes you're surprised by what they identify with and what they don't identify with.
I had been at war against the social sciences now for the last 20 years of my writing life. In this room tonight is my first editor, my great editor, Bill Goodman, who was the editor for Hunger of Memory, and who will always be, in my mind, my editor. But one of the things I did with that first book, which got me in trouble with the ethnic left in this country, was that I went to war against the political and social vocabulary of my time, words like minority, which seemed very easy for politicians to use, disadvantaged. I began to stretch them and wonder, what does it mean? Or when educationists at the education school here at Harvard talked about bilingual education, the advantage of having children use what they call their family language in the classroom, I began to play with what that might mean, to use one's family language in the classroom. And I'm still at it. I'm still trying to steal the world back from the politicians and the social sciences and CNN, to say nothing of O'Reilly on Fox, these people who use language like it's tin. And they speak of Hispanics. I want to know who a Hispanic is. When Richard Nixon invents Asians, I want to know, have you ever met an Asian? What do they sound like? What do they eat, Asians? I'm even interested in the word white. I haven't met very many white people. I meet a lot of pink people. I meet a lot of yellow people and freckled people. People who are browner than I am, but they call themselves white. Bill Clinton is one of the whitest persons I've ever met. He's almost albino. He says that he's 1/16 American Indian. And I meet kids who come up to me and say, I'm white, I'm nothing, they will say. Or I'm white, I have no culture. I think to myself, it's Melville's whale. It is an absence of being, whiteness. I take this language away from the political realm precisely because I want to personalize it, I want to poeticize it, I want literature to belong to this conversation. And what I hate, or makes me very uncomfortable, is somebody who comes up and treats me like a case study. You know, I had this same experience as you. That's what you tell us, somebody on Oprah. Oprah, I was also raped when I was 12. And she talks to the woman who's written a book about being raped when you're 12. And they're all happy together because they can all talk about the experience of 12-dom. Well, the experience of being a Richard Rodriguez is like nothing else. It is a completely odd, eccentric, singular experience. But the premise of writing, of literature, is that within the singularity of a life is where we find our kinship. It is not as our lives are twin, but it's precisely in the difference of the life, the fact of your idiosyncrasy, that I sense my own. What writing always teaches us is not that we were coming in from Logan Airport this afternoon, the most extraordinary conversation with a cab driver from Ghana who was reading Jane Austen. I mean, I've come into Boston many times and had many conversations about many subjects, but I've never talked to a Ghanaian cab driver about Jane Austen. And when I told him I was coming to this hall tonight, to this church, he was so pleased for me, this man who loves literature, that he would not accept payment for the cab ride. But it seems to me the last thing I wanted him to say is that my life was his, or mine, or his mine. That what writing teaches me is the reverse, is that there is something so remarkably special about us. And that what we sense in reading is a shared loneliness, something closer to what the Puritans knew in halls like this in another century. That when I would confess my life, it was not because it was similar to yours, but because what we shared was the experience of our isolation. Speak to me.
You're listening to Richard Rodriguez discussing Brown, The Last Discovery of America. We do have a few minutes for questions from the audience. If you have questions, please come to the central microphone.
Completely spellbound audience. Shy. Shy as only Cambridge can be shy in May. A long winter.
Well, I'm deeply moved by what you have had to say and how you have said it.
Thank you.
I'm having trouble connecting it with another part of life that I also see, which is, I think, a very strong pattern or movement at this, like the last 25 years, of people identifying very particularly as opposed to everyone else. Even the census now listing 50 or 60 races would be an example of that. It's not the old race as black and white, but neither is it brown. It's a lot of segmentation,
Yes.
fracturing, finding a group, ethnicity as one group as opposed to the rest of the world. And can you help me put that together?
Yeah, no, I go to high schools all over this country, and the children of American high schools, where I go to speak as a good Canadian about multiculturalism, these kids have had multiculturalism up to here. The principal will say that there are 70, 80 language groups at the school. You go into the school cafeteria, and these kids have organized themselves not by race or color necessarily, but by musical note. Over there's a table for hip-hop. Over here is a table for heavy metal or bisexual inclination. Over here is a table for queers. Over here is a table for Mormons. Mormons who sit under the tree at Livermore High School. They sit under the oak tree when the weather is fine. The Mormons sit by themselves. When the weather is cloudy and gray, the Mormons sit over here. Over here is a table for jocks. Over here is a table for nerds. Over here is a table for kids who want to go to MIT next year and who are very, very traumatized already by the prospect. Over here is a table with girls who have red and green hair who call themselves sluts. It is very, very interesting the way this inclination to separate and to distinguish oneself in a world where there is less and less possibility of it, which suggests back to the problem that we have, and that is the browner the world gets, the more inclination I think people are going to have to create gated communities, little ways of marking me off against you, and so forth. I don't deny that human impulse or that human intention. I even find it amiable and amusing and so forth, but it doesn't seem to me to be finally true to our lives. Our life really is experienced most boldly and most creatively now within the brown flux. And I think children would be well advised to leave that cafeteria table once in a while and to wander into another table. It is very, very hard to do that. These kids will penalize each other for that crime. And it is worrisome. It is worrisome. You know, I speak in front of lots of different groups in America, and I realize just how self-segregated these groups are. I refer in my book to an evening at the University of Arizona. I'm reading at 6:30 in the evening. So I get Mexican Americans. They come to listen to Richard Rodriguez. We're matched. Sociological types. 8 o'clock, there's a lesbian poet. It is about 7:45. There is a very beautiful young man sitting right over there. He's very petulant. He's been petulant all evening. I'm supposed to notice. When people are very beautiful, you're always supposed to notice that they're unhappy. We're always supposed to listen to their story. He starts. I'm still 5 minutes away from saying goodnight, but he's doing this. Then he gets up, this petulant, beautiful young Latino who thinks he's Zorro. He gets up and he walks out the hallway, up this hallway, to the back of the auditorium. He swings open the doors, and there in the lobby is a sea of lesbiana, every ducktail you will ever expect to see in your life. And I think to myself, damn it, why can't I get the ducktails for one night? Why do the ducktails go to the ducktail poet? Why can't we ever exchange audiences once in a while? It was a particular brown freedom of mine as a child to wander freely because I was irrelevant in America. I'm also irreverent. I was irrelevant in America that no one really knew how to say no to me. I remember Malcolm X came to Sacramento in the 1960s. Malcolm came, and I was interested very much in what Malcolm X was about and his journey and his anger. I did not know at the time that his audiences were largely restricted, usually restricted to African American audiences. I appeared at the auditorium where he was speaking in Sacramento. It was a small community center. There were these two men standing at the door. One looked like Sonny Liston, the other one looked like Mike Tyson. These two thugs looked at me, and I could see the calculations behind their eyes, what to do with the brown boy. And they let me in. I've been wandering in places where I have no business belonging for a long time because I was irrelevant in this country. I remember when Lyndon Johnson, there was a riot, I think in Cicero or maybe Chicago. And Lyndon Johnson, good old Lyndon Johnson, our last black and white president, he did what good liberals do when there's a black riot. He formed a commission to find out why. We still had to form a commission to find out why. Why were they so angry after all of these generations? We still had to ask why. Anyway, he appointed the governor of Illinois, a man named Kerner, otherwise a forgettable political career, completely compromised by this document that bears his name, the Kerner Report, in which he predicted, the Kerner Commission predicted that America was dividing into two, one side black, the other side white. I was about 16 years old at the time. I remember this anger welling within me, just coming into my throat, my wanting to say, I want some part of this conversation in America. I want to be here at this podium. I want to speak brownly to those nice people at Cambridge. I want to be a brown man in this conversation in this black and white nation. Let me in. But it inevitably will happen that Richard Rodriguez will be at the University of Arizona, and there will his audience be. Mexican Americans like himself, God bless them. And the lesbians will be outdoors, waiting to come in, and Zorro will be petulant because of something I've said or left unsaid. And so it goes in brown America.
Thank you, Richard Rodriguez.